Hey y'all, Broderick here with the OAnalysis for episode 6, titled Forking Paths. At the time of this writing, this is the shortest episode of the OA, clocking in at just over 31 minutes. Even though it's a shorter episode, I've probably done more research and reading to get ready for this one than any prior episode, and I'm sure to have missed something, so feel free to let me know in the comments. Well, that being said, there's a lot to talk about, so let's go. The episode opens with Buck trying to sneak out to the abandoned house, but his parents are arguing downstairs. I mentioned in my review for OA that Britt and Zal had reached out to Ian Alexander regarding the show's portrayal of a trans teen. According to an interview with Ian, the argument Buck's parents are having mirrors an experience that Ian himself had to go through. Unable to sneak out, Buck stands in front of his mirror and practices a part of the movements. After he's finally able to get out of the house, he passes the remnants of an accident, which includes a backpack and closely mirrors what Rachel described in Champion. After Buck finally makes it to the house,
Oh, way late, dude. She's an MMA.
OA continues her story. She tells the group that in another 2 years of captivity, Renata had gotten the fourth movement, and Rachel never received one. As Scott and Renata practice, OA and Homer make up pictures representing the movements that they carve into their own bodies. According to Renata's guardian,
told her one of the side effects of dimensional travel is amnesia.
After OA shows the Crestwood Five her scars representing the movements, Jesse asks what'll opening a tunnel to another dimension look like.
I don't know. I've never done it.
She describes how it's like jumping into an invisible river that just carries you away.
The person leaving this dimension would experience a great acceleration of events, but no break in time-space.
Meanwhile, while the captives practice in their cages, Hap also practices them alone upstairs. In the year since Renata came back with the fourth movement, OA began to wonder if they would ever get the fifth. While the captives all had each other, there was only one person Hap could talk to, another doctor named Leon. Leon works out of an abandoned mortuary wing of a hospital.
Really, this entire wing of the hospital is dead.
And Hap had his residency under him. Hap admits to Leon that sometimes he feels guilty for the experiments they perform.
Here's the terrible, beautiful truth. There is no line between good and evil. There's only what a man can stand.
Leon is also trying to map out what's on the other side of death and tells Hap that within the next 12 to 18 months,
I'll be able to offer incontrovertible proof of an afterlife.
he explains to Hap that his current working theory states that after death, there is another dimension we would travel to. Hap counters with the thought that it may not just be one dimension, it's many.
The many worlds theory?
Well, no, not exactly. No.
Hap explains it as a garden of forking paths, and that he may know exactly where his subjects travel to. He's purposely vague, and he wants to travel there himself first, and he simply wants to know the truth of it all.
So I'm getting carried away. It's probably all bullshit, and you're right.
After all this, Leon tells Hap there's something unusual he'd like to show him.
Cold chamber on the far wall. Open it. In the center, number 20.
Hap opens the door and finds an empty chamber with embalming fluid. He turns to Leon, asking what he's supposed to be looking at. Leon, at gunpoint, asks Hap where his test subjects are going to.
Tell me!
Leon feels Hap may destroy his years of work. As they fight, Hap manages to get the upper hand, and he pushes Leon's head into the embalming fluid. A few moments later, Leon stops fighting. Personally, dying by drowning on embalming fluid is probably number 2 on my list of worst ways to die, right behind slowly burning to death and before suffocation. On his way out of the hospital, Hap stops to give the morgue keycard to a nurse and tells her,
There are people there that need help.
Sir? Sir, what do you mean people?
Back in his lab, Hap takes OA to his death apparatus. As she waits for Hap to lock her in, the back view of the device looks like angel wings on OA. He expresses his concern for finding the fifth movement, and he even offers to take OA away from there.
I have a proposal for you. We leave tomorrow.
His plan involves using the first and second movements to charge the world's wealthiest for healing. OA declines, realizing that something is amiss by the marks he sustained from his fight with Leon.
Who did that to your head? Something happened.
He cites that he did what he had to do in order to protect his work while he finishes setting up the machine.
I'll take you anywhere you want to go.
I will not go with you.
As OA dies yet again, she arrives in the star-filled chamber. Only this time, there's no one there to greet her. She begs Katoon for the fifth movement, but no one answers, and the stars fade one by one before she jolts back into the real world. Hap tells her he heard something and plays several sounds before she recognizes what she heard in her NDE. She thinks it's just another soundscape recording, but Hap was playing a sound recorded by NASA from the rings of Saturn.
The rings of Saturn. They sing.
In her cell, she tells Homer she doesn't think they'll ever get the fifth movement.
When we were in the lab, he confided in me. What did we think was going to happen anyway?
We don't know.
Homer reassures her, and they talk about getting their own place and growing vegetables.
Come on, we don't know anything about vegetables. They don't die.
Yeah, they die. So we try again.
Homer tells OA that with enough determination and foresight, they'll be able to reap the benefits of a garden. This gives OA the determination to go on. Upstairs, meanwhile, Hap is listening to the NASA recording of the rings of Saturn. Stan, the officer from the previous episode, comes by. Hap left his door open, so Stan invites himself in. Upon seeing Hap's monitors, he realizes what's going on, draws his gun, and places it against the back of Hap's head. Back in the present, Mr. Vu finds his front door open. He calls for Buck, then shuts the door. So, this episode simultaneously gives the most evidence backing up both that she's lying and that she's telling the truth. Probably the biggest aspect that she may be lying is the entire sequence with Leon. She wasn't directly involved, so it seems suspicious that she would have intimate details of Leon and Hap's interaction. On the flip side, the fact that she admits she doesn't know what interdimensional travel would look like can be proof that she's telling the truth. After all, if she's making up everything else, why wouldn't she make this up as well? If she is telling the truth, I have one theory as to how she knows the story of Leon.
When we were in the lab, he confided in me.
It shows us Hap and OA's conversation before she gets put into the machine, but once she comes out, it jumps to her shivering with the heat blanket on her. There's an unspecified amount of time between her coming to and her sitting with Hap in his office. There's a very real possibility that Hap expressed more of the Leon story to her during this time frame, or before putting her back in the cage. Without reading ahead, I'm of two minds about this. She very well could be lying, but there's still a lot to go through, so we'll see. I may have mentioned this before, but the subtlety of the acting is amazing. When Buck makes it to the abandoned house and OA tells him,
No, we waited for you. Come on.
I love how Buck's features melt into a smile. It reminds me of Steve and OA's talk in Champion.
Families suck.
Not the ones you build. And they work. They don't look like they should, but they do.
Likewise, OA has grown more comfortable around them as well. Instead of jumping like she did in Champion, she allows Buck to touch the scars on her back without fear. It's subtlety like this that makes me love this show. While I'm praising the acting, I just want to mention the actual danger of the drowning machine they built for the show. When you see OA strapped in this machine, that's really Britt Marling with her head in water. The amount of trust she put into the cast and crew of the OA is astounding. She had stated in interviews how dangerous the device actually is, so the fact that they didn't use any CGI is what makes it look so authentic. It's because it is. So the last thing I want to talk about in the spoiler-free section is the mention of A Garden of Forking Paths. Before I begin, I must apologize in advance, as I'm probably going to butcher several names in this section. As I attempt to speak the names, I'll throw them up on the screen. Anyways, in addition to being something commonly said by the characters, A Garden of Forking Paths is a short story written in 1941 by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. In this story, written entirely from the point of view of one Dr. Hugh Sun, a Chinese man who is a former English professor at the Hochschule at Tsingtao and resides in the UK during World War I. Dr. Sun worked as a spy for German intelligence and was being hunted by an Irishman named Richard Madden. Before Madden could catch up with Sun hatches a plan to inform German intelligence of the location of a new British artillery park. To execute his plan, he takes a train to Ashgrove to seek out a Dr. Stephen Albert. Upon exiting the train, he is giving directions to Dr. Albert's residence. At every fork in the path, turn to the left. Soon reminisces that this is also the directions to find the center of a labyrinth. Anyway, he makes it to Dr. Albert's residence. Dr. Albert had worked as a missionary in Tianjin before aspiring to be a sinologist, so he was fluent in Chinese and, surprisingly to Dr. Sun, had studied Sun's ancestor, Sui Pian. Sui Pian, an astronomer, astrologer, chess player, poet, and calligrapher, had resigned himself to write a book and to construct a labyrinth. After he was killed by a stranger, his book was found, but the labyrinth never was. What he did was leave a note saying, "I leave to the various futures, but not all, my garden of forking paths. which Dr. Albert shows to Dr. Soon. As for the book, later generations found it confusing and nonsensical. For example, the hero dies in Chapter 3 and is alive in Chapter 4. Dr. Albert explains to Dr. Soon that the labyrinth Soon Penn created was the book he wrote. The book, he suspects, was written with all possible futures occurring at once. The example he gives to Soon is that time moves and forks into innumerable futures. In one, Dr. Soon is Dr. Albert's friend. In another, his enemy. In yet another, Dr. Soon doesn't exist, and another where Dr. Albert doesn't. After Dr. Albert explains all of this, Dr. Soon asks to see the letter from before once again. As Dr. Albert turns his back to retrieve the letter, Dr. Soon pulls out a gun and instantly kills Dr. Albert, just as Richard Madden arrives to arrest him. The newspapers after his arrest read that Dr. Yu Soon killed Dr. Stephen Albert. Dr. Soon had successfully informed German intelligence of the location of the secret British artillery park in a province called Albert. I've left out some significant details, so I would recommend reading the story for yourself, especially if you've watched all of the OA. I checked out a translation of Jorge's work titled Labyrinths from a local library, but you can also order it from Amazon. Anyway, at the beginning of the story, Soon points out the absurdity of his actions, locking his door or weighing his gun in his hands. I bring this up as a continuation from my talk on the previous episode. The absurd is philosophized about in detail by the likes of Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And I would recommend reading The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus if this interests you. Borges' philosophies vary from both Sartre and Camus, but there's definitely some crossovers of tone and intent. The idea of a garden of forking paths is brought up several times throughout the run of OA, so for now, I'll leave it at that. Going forward, there may be some spoilers for the OA. If you don't mind some minor spoilers, keep watching. Otherwise, close the video and feel free to come back once you've finished watching the show. The first thing I want to bring up is the accident Buck passes on his way to the house. The accident, the car bumper, and the backpack are definitely reminiscent from Rachel's story. Personally, where I think it's supposed to remind us of her story, I don't think it has anything to do with it at all. Straight through to part 2, the only talk of time travel is from within their NDEs. OA even says in this episode,
The person leaving this dimension would experience a great acceleration of events, but no break in time-space.
Meaning if you're jumping into another dimension, it'll be the same date and time as when you left. So far, other than inside their NDEs, there's been no time travel mechanic introduced. Given some events in part 2, that may change by part 3, but personally I'm skeptical. Next is regarding A Garden of Forking Paths. I really don't have much else to say except pointing out at several scenes and saying, yes, it's referenced here too. The idea that reality can fork into a new path with every choice we make, and that all choices are always made at each juncture, but are inaccessible by us, is an idea that gets explored in more detail as the show goes into part 2. Really, the only other thing I want to touch on is the scarification OA and Homer go through. This is actually just another reason to take her story as true. After all, when they actually do get to jump, I'm sure it never occurred to them that they leave their physical bodies behind. This episode, short as it is, gives us some of the best philosophies thus far. I mentioned in Paradise how that episode made me fall in love with this show, but this episode reinforces that idea with philosophies I haven't seen in a show since I watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where that show had philosophies regarding growing up, choice, and dealing with the pressures from the world as a young adult. The OA is a show more about dealing with the adversary and the choices we're forced to make as an adult. If you've watched the OA and fell in love with it, I couldn't recommend watching Buffy enough. Just be mindful the first season is pretty rough. Anyway, that's all I have. If you've watched this far, thanks. Feel free to like, subscribe, and share. Have a great day. Peace.